Hello and welcome to US LawShield Live. We're starting over again. We had some technical difficulties. We didn't start right on the dot, but if you heard us, if you saw what we were talking about, we're going to go over it one more time just in case anybody missed it. Today we're talking about the truth about ghost guns. I'm independent program attorney Richard Hayes.
And I'm independent program attorney Emily Taylor.
And we are talking ghost guns today, unserialized firearms, modified firearms. And we got these questions from a previous discussion we had. And that's where these questions are going to be coming from. And we just started. This is the beginning of the stream. So if you have questions, post them in the chat. Because right now we're still ground level, just getting started. There's a good chance that your question is going to get answered. So post your questions in the comments section. And let's start talking ghost guns. So before we, let's lay groundwork. When we say that, what do we mean?
Yeah, so I mean, I think initial groundwork here, ghost gun is not our preferred term, right? No. So that is kind of the, I think, sensationalized, trying to get you a little bit scared of these items term. What we're really talking about is unserialized receivers, right? We're talking about things 80% lowers. There was a lot of hubbub about 3D printed guns a couple years ago when I think it was Defense
Distributed and Cody Wilson and DefCAD.
Exactly, looking at putting those plans out. So what we're talking about here, it's not spooky. It's not something that really should get people worried. It's the American tradition of constructing and building your own firearm.
Yep.
In this case, with something that is unserialized.
Yeah. So when we say ghost gun or you hear the term ghost gun, really at the end of the day, it means homemade firearm.
Exactly.
And why is this such a controversy, do you think?
Here's why. There is a triad of ways that I think the anti-gun folks try to restrict our Second Amendment rights. We talk about restricting who can possess firearms. We talk about restricting where you can possess firearms. And this is just one leg of that triangle to restrict Second Amendment rights, which is what you can possess. That's a great way to restrict the Second Amendment. And so we're talking about this because there is now, and really the last couple of years, a push to restrict these unserialized firearms, 80% lowers, 3D printed firearms. Your collective ghost gun is one of those things that is really it's in the crosshairs for the anti-gunners.
Yeah, and I'd say the two things that I see come up over and over when it comes to, hey, this is why anti-gunners want these things regulated. The 2 points that I hear argued over and over is, it skips the universal background check that you would have to typically go through a federal firearms licensed dealer and FFL. And then the second argument that I hear on that front is the firearms trace that the ATF performs. If a gun is found at a crime scene, what the ATF does is they trace it back to the manufacturer and then who it got distributed to, and then, the FFL, the gun store that eventually sold it, and the point of sale, who actually bought the gun, and an attempt to locate, a suspect in the gun crime. And we find time and time again that person who bought the gun isn't a lot of the times the person who used the gun in a crime.
Exactly.
But it brings up the question of, are ghost guns legal?
Yeah, so that's our first question that we've gotten.
Yeah.
And, the answer is, generally speaking, now, of course, there are some states, and you probably know who you are, where unserialized, where 80% lowers are heavily regulated. I don't know of any state in which they are flat illegal. Right. But, New Jersey could have done something overnight I'm unaware of. But it is, as a general matter, lawful and legal to purchase that 80% lower, to mill it out yourself, to have that unserialized firearm. Now, I say that with restrictions, obviously. I mean, I think there's a biggie that's actually in our 18 U.S.C. 922, right? Which is our Undetectable Firearms Act.
Yeah.
Do you want to get into that?
Yeah, 18 U.S.C. 922, I believe it's P. Yes, it's P. And that relates to undetectable firearms. These two things kind of get mixed together. And essentially what that law says is that you can't make a firearm or possess a firearm, transfer a firearm, sell a firearm that can't be detectable by a metal detector. They use that for airport security. I mean, the security devices they have at airports now can detect all kinds of stuff, baseball cards even. So I don't know that it's as big of an issue as it used to be, but the Untraceable Firearms Act, I believe, of 1988, those two things kind of get conflated. And that's, if you're making a homemade gun, they don't want it made 100% out of polymers or plastics. Right. It needs to be detectable by a metal detector because that's a crime.
Yeah, and that's something that came up a lot when we were talking about Cody Wilson. We were talking about distributing the 3D printed firearm map, and people were saying, this should be a crime. And, we were saying, there's already a criminal offense out there
Right.
for, if you could manage to create your own DIY firearm, your own, quote unquote ghost gun that was not detectable through metal detectors, that would already be an offense.
Right. And then the other point that we see coming up, so time and time again, and I think we have these kind of three categories for our homemade firearms: unserialized firearms, because some states criminalize just that. Not, you could maybe make a homemade firearm, but it has to be serialized. And then we have our third category that says no homemade firearms. It has to have a serial number. And we see that coming up in California with, I think they called it Assembly Bill 879. And they're regulating, what they are calling homemade firearms. They call them precursor parts.
Precursor parts, exactly.
And so, there's two kind of versions of this bill went out in California. One would ban all firearms parts, think triggers, really insignificant things.
What is going on in California?
Yeah, right.
We could do an entire live stream that was called "What is Going On in California."
I like a regular segment. But with the final bill that ended up passing relates only to molds and casts and 80% lowers for handguns and rifles. And now if you want to engage in the hobby, you would have to go through an FFL or a dealer, and you would have to undergo that background check. So we see that come up. Remember, that's California. That's not
right.
That's not the entire United States. But it raises this issue that we see, I think, comes up every now and then, is whether you can, let's assume that you can lawfully make a homemade firearm. Can you sell it?
Yeah. I mean, the most conservative legal advice I give people is if you have, milled out your 80% lower, it's yours.
Yeah.
Don't sell it. There are laws in place. You can't manufacture something without having a manufacturer's license,
right,
with the intent that you distribute it. So, I mean, that actually goes so far as, let's say that I have an 80% receiver. You have, the equipment to mill it out.
Right.
I can't hand it to you and ask you to mill it out for me and give it back to me.
Right. That would make me
You'd be an unlicensed manufacturer.
Manufacturer. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That would be a crime. But generally speaking, and we get into these legal hypotheticals about like, well, you manufactured it decades ago, and you obviously didn't intend that you did it for distribution, but now you want to sell it out of your personal collection. Is there legality to be had there? A legal hypothesis is wonderful.
Right.
Possibly you're just fine in that circumstance. I still tell people, play it safe. If you have created your own firearm, I'm gonna die with it.
Right.
Is my plan.
Well, and it changes the conversation, and this is how it would come up. A gun that you made shows up at a crime scene, and you didn't commit the crime, and now they're going to try to figure out what was the origin of this firearm. And if they trace it back to the person who constructed this firearm, if they're not a licensed manufacturer, they're going to have a bad time. And that's how it comes up over and over again. And I think that's kind of going back to our earlier discussion. A question came up now about some history on the Gun Control Act and serialized firearms. I think that fits in really well right here.
It does. I love reminding people that it was not a requirement that your firearm receiver be serialized until 1968, right? Until the Gun Control Act. It's something that we so take for granted now. But I know, we're here in Texas. In Texas, there are Lord knows how many unserialized firearms floating around just in the general public here that were manufactured not by individuals, but by manufacturers. They're just not serialized because they were manufactured before 68, right? And that's perfectly fine here in Texas. Again, the states vary on this matter, but, in the grand history of the United States and firearms and the Second Amendment, serial numbers are a relatively new invention.
And that reminds me of the point too that federal law only requires FFLs, federal licensed dealers, to keep the records for 20 years, and I bet a lot of gun stores keep them longer than that. I know a handful of FFLs who, the timer hits 20 years and they're destroying their record because legally they're not obligated to keep them anymore. But that just shows there's probably quite a few firearms out there that couldn't be traced if these FFLs are destroying the records after 20 years.
Yeah, certainly.
Good question that just came in because we're talking about the legality of ghost guns. Giovanni asked, can I conceal carry a home-built firearm?
Yeah, generally speaking, so long as the possession is legal in your state, which in the vast majority of states it is, absolutely. It's the same sort of thing when we talk to people and they get worried about, hey, I'm in a state which allows unfettered private sales. And I purchased this weapon through, I purchased this handgun through a private sale, and it's not registered to me. And what's going to happen if the police pull me over and they run the serial number? And really, in the vast majority of states, now, of course, we're not talking about California. We're not talking about states where you have to have, a FOID and you have to have things really well documented as to what you own and who you are. And, so the states can be well ready to take your rights away from you. We're talking about the rest of us here. There's no problem. So unserialized, absolutely fine. And, in that situation that comes up more often, which is, I'm not the original purchaser. I'm worried that the serial number is connected to someone else's name. No worries there.
Right.
As a general principle.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that when law enforcement comes into contact with a firearm, when they're running the serial number, they're not cross-referencing against some giant database. And we have heard,
that's a good point.
Yeah, we've heard some news on this front about, the GOA has released information about the ATF consolidating closed down FFL records and creating, a registry they're not supposed to be creating. But, what we see now is when law enforcement is running that number, they're seeing if the gun shows up in a lost or stolen property database.
Right.
They're not seeing if, does this gun,
they're not
is it
pulling
tied
the
to this
FFL
person?
database.
No,
exactly.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Question that comes up. Next question. What happens if you get caught with a ghost gun? Because it falls in that same category. Let's say you're unlawful possession of your homemade firearm, you're concealed carrying it as your personal defense firearm, you're beat bopping down the street, and for whatever reason the police have reasonable suspicion to think you're committing a crime, or you match the description of someone. They come and they temporarily disarm you. All right, you're in contact with law enforcement, you have this homemade firearm. What's going on next?
Yeah, probably absolutely nothing, right?
Yep.
You don't have anything to worry about. Now, unless you happen to be, I think this sort of dovetails into our next question, which is, how often are ghost guns used in crimes?
Yeah.
And, we tried to actually find statistics on this to see, but here's the thing, not very often.
Right.
There aren't good statistics. And why is that? Well, your average criminal who's running around, on the streets, committing dope rips and knocking over liquor stores and things like that, they aren't milling out their own firearms. They're not 3D printing firearms. They're getting them from breaking out someone's car window and stealing a gun, right? I mean, these are, for the most part, the guns that are used in criminal offenses, they're stolen guns that were stolen off people who were allowed to have them. And so the firearms that are used in crimes are just representative of firearm ownership throughout the United States because they're stolen from the general public.
Yeah,
so
the number
really
that
very few.
Yeah, the number that I saw was from 2019, and it was less. It was a couple of hundred. It wasn't very many. It was a very small number. But it goes on. Marty asked, and this is, I think, worth expanding on. What's going on with the ATF records taken from FFLs going out of business? Just to expand on that just a little bit. We mentioned it kind of in passing, but it's worth talking about because it is kind of a hot button topic right now. So when an FFL closes down, they turn their records over to the ATF. Typically they have these records not centralized in a database. They're kind of kept in hard copy or on a film. They're not in a computerized or searchable, and it's going to come up in a moment with how the Biden administration wants to crack down on non-compliant FFLs. Because I think they're trying to make this database as large as they can.
Oh, yeah.
So that's something that I think everybody needs to be monitoring. But what the enforcement action the Biden administration plans on taking is it's a zero tolerance policy for federal firearms license dealers, for gun stores. If they mess up a record, they don't report properly, they're trying to seek to terminate the person's license. And so we talked about our FFL going out of business, turning their record over to the ATF. Well, if you no longer have your license anymore, you get your license revoked, you have to turn your records over. And so that kind of feeds into what is the Biden administration doing?
Yeah. So, and this actually starts in a place that's legally very interesting for me because I have spent, I can't tell you how many hours trying to figure out how and why the federal government made this rule that a receiver that is 80% finished is not a receiver.
Yep.
And there is nothing that I can come up with for why they made this decision, which is interesting, but then legally terrifying, right? Because it means they could change their mind at any moment. I mean, what's to stop the administration from directing that, a block of metal that is 50% finished
Right.
is actually a firearm receiver. What's to stop them from saying any block of metal is a firearms receiver? Because when I can't come up with why it's 80%, it could be anything.
The Home Depot is going to have to get their FFL.
Right.
And whenever you go buy a block of aluminum, you're going to have to, pass a background check. I don't know what their plan is.
It's crazy. But I think that, first step in regulating these so-called ghost guns is to say that an 80% receiver is in fact a firearm, must be serialized, must go through an FFL dealer, background check must be conducted. That's, I think, obvious step one that we need to be on the lookout for that has been proposed. Shadow step two, right, is slowly start creeping back. What is a firearm receiver?
Right.
Because, as soon as they say that, the entrepreneurs out there are going to say, oh, that's great. Well, here is a 75% receiver.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't regulate me, and so we're going to start moving the goalpost until we may land in a very scary place.
Right. And I thought, and it's pretty interesting going back. We've already said his name a couple of times, but Cody Wilson, Defense Distributed, they have the 0% receiver, with the Ghost Gunner 3. You put in a block of metal and a lower comes out. And so it's made basically impossible to regulate at this point. I mean, the cat's out of the bag and the technology is there. And so, we'll see where that fight goes. But that kind of brings up the second prong, I think, of the administration's attack on unserialized firearms. And I think Dave asked a perfect question, can you gift your firearm to a family member, let's say your daughter, or your son or a relative? And I think it kind of goes back to our, can you sell it? Almost in the same way, because what they're interested in is the Biden administration is going to, the way they're going to crack down on these things is finding these unlicensed dealers.
Correct.
And so can you tell us what that looks like?
Yeah. And so, when we talk about sale, that's kind of the easy way to sort of generalize this. But what the federal government and what the state governments are generally interested in is not necessarily sale, it's transfer. Right? Transfer of ownership. So, you walk into an FFL dealer, that's one thing. But otherwise, when we're talking about private sales, we're really talking about private transfers, right? And so, for the most part, you want to make a private transfer. It's going to go by the same sale rules we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Are you transferring this gun because you intended to make a transfer? Again, the most conservative legal advice is if you have made your own firearm, do not transfer, whether it's sell or gift.
So I guess another question. So Wiggs asks, how are 80% receiver sales recorded? Are they the same as, let's say you go to a gun store, you buy it from a gun shop, and what we see is these kits are available online. They vary from, breaking away plastic or cutting away plastic and drilling holes to you need to have a drill press to what we've seen with some of these CAD machines where they can go from 0 to a full receiver all at once. And so how are they recorded? I mean, these companies are required. They have their sales records.
They have their sales records. Exactly.
Right. And I would think I imagine, because this is, we're thinking about this on the fly, but I imagine it's a lot like how we've seen solvent traps treated by the federal government.
I was going to say exactly the same thing.
And so tell us what you've seen.
Yeah. So what we're not going to have here is your 4473 and your very intensive kind of, you've got to keep your records. The federal government's allowed to come in and inspect your records. There's going to be punishment if you don't do it right. It's just going to be, like if you're selling coffee mugs, right? Yeah. It's just those sales records. Now, does that mean that the government doesn't get access to them? No. Right. We saw with solvent traps. We saw with force reset triggers. We have seen several times now. So with the red coat hangers, right? And we're sort of, we're delving there into these kind of quasi NFA item issues. But the federal government just has a warrant, right? They subpoena your records or they get a warrant to search your records. They find the data that way. And then, unfortunately, the end user gets kind of the nasty gram of, hey, you possess something that's illegal, call us immediately.
Right.
So, I mean, it's really, it's just the same thing as, if a drug dealer was keeping purchase records or sale records, the state would go in and get those.
No, it's a ledger.
It's just a ledger, exactly. Yes. But except now we're saying, well, this item is illegal because it's, solvent traps are illegal. So we're, going in because you're not just a business, you are a criminal actor.
Well, and keep your questions coming. We're getting a ton of questions, but keep them coming. We have a lot of ground to cover. And I think this discussion fits in with Walter asked, will you guys talk about modifications to factory firearms as well? And I think that fits in perfectly with the, these online sales or the kits and, these parts, just like Emily was discussing, how they're not having formalized records like they would if they were a gun store. Having a modification to a firearm. Let's say you home make everything, but then you buy a part, or a optic, or buy it from an online retailer. I think that falls into the same category as well, and it doesn't necessarily need to be, a homemade firearm or even a ghost gun.
Right. Yeah. I mean, anytime you're sort of composing in some way your own firearm, it's something to think about that could fall into this bucket. Our general modifications, though, and I think it's Walter, you should be perfectly fine, but be sure that the modification you intend to make is legal. Most are, right? When we're talking about triggers, we're talking about sights. I mean, even just constructing your own rifle from an AR receiver, right? But bear in mind, I mean, there are lots of people who call us and they've seen something online. It's marketed as legal.
Right.
And they say, I want to buy this kit. It's going to do this thing. And we have to say, no. Right. I mean, an interesting one comes to mind. We had our shockwaves, right? Which we know, or, your shockwave is legal, right? However, there are these little kits that actually convert the bird's head grip to other things, and you can move them back and forth. Probably not legal, right? Just because you can buy it on the internet doesn't mean that it's legal.
Yes, or with whatever you're assembling, maybe in a vacuum or maybe on a particular firearm, that part is legal.
Correct.
And the manufacturer and the seller, that's on the up and up, but they don't know what you're going to put it on.
Yes.
If you're selling vertical foregrips, well, that's inherently not good or bad. It just is what it is.
Don't put it on a handgun.
You place it on a pistol, then you're going to get in trouble. Exactly right. Really interesting question from Aaron. Is it legal to inherit a homemade firearm?
Yeah, I mean, it should be.
Yeah.
Because at that point, the person who's really in trouble for the potential transfer of that unserialized firearm is the guy who manufactured it.
Yeah.
The guy who manufactured it, if it's passed through an estate, I don't see a legal problem there.
No, I don't see a legal problem. Or I see the Department of Justice having a hard time of charging a corpse with being an unlicensed dealer of a firearm.
Yes, right.
But again, it's going to depend on the state, because some states, they have prohibitions on it, especially if it's unserialized. So like we said, we have those 3 buckets of homemade guns, can't do it at all. Homemade gun, okay, so long as it's serialized, and then you're, free for all depending on where you live. But it's going to depend on the law in your state. Obviously, the firearm still has to be legal. I see that come up from time to time, where a person passes away and they had a machine gun that they brought home from, at the time and didn't register it. And what's happening to this machine gun now? It was never registered. And at the end of the day, the firearm still has to be legal.
Exactly right. And, there are lots of, federal law exemptions to estate transfers, which makes life easy. But the base legality of the firearm is not one of them.
Right.
It's things like you don't have to go through an FFL dealer to transfer interstate when someone dies.
Right.
It's not actually this item that was hot lava becomes lawful.
Right.
So.
No, perfect example. Michael asks, let's say that he has to use his AR with an 80% blower that he manufactured in self-defense. Could that be considered a legal firearm? And I think what he's referring to is, how is this going to come up in my self-defense case? And so...
Is the prosecutor going to use it against you, Richard?
Yes. No, absolutely. Yes. I mean, it's going to get used against you. And the way that I think about firearms modifications, and I think homemade guns fall into the same category, assuming it's legal, is it's a function-enhancing modification. That's how I think about these things. Is it function-enhancing? Is it not function-enhancing? And making a firearm in and of itself, that's function enhancing. It's there for your self-defense. It's not wacky or out of control or going to build a terrible narrative. The narrative is going to be, hey, look at this wacko who makes his own guns. But I think at the end of the day, that could be explained away by a skillful defense attorney. A non-function enhancing modification, if you inscribed something cheeky on the side of it or painted, the ATF agents with the binoculars on the dust cover, maybe they don't like that so much, and juries wouldn't respond well to that. But I think just a it's no different than if you went and bought it at a store.
Right. And, it's just, it's a matter of risk tolerance,
Yep.
basically, because you know that the things that you do are going to be used against you by a prosecutor.
Yeah.
Really, the only worry I would say is if you know that you cannot be in possession of that gun because the state you live in, right? Let's fast forward California a couple years from now.
Yeah.
And you know that you have this unserialized receiver and you didn't go through an FFL. Well, at that point, once you're committing other crimes, you don't lose your self-defense rights, but you've made your life a lot harder. In most states, you've lost stand your ground if you're committing another offense.
Legal presumptions.
You've maybe lost presumptions. Exactly. So, I would think of it not in terms of, is a prosecutor going to use this against me? Because they are. Right? That's what they do.
Yeah.
But in terms of, is this legal? And if the answer is yes, you've not lost stand your ground. You've not lost any presumptions. Let your defense attorney, that's what we do, right? Let your defense attorney handle the rest.
Yeah, and to expand on that, because and Texas is a good illustration, I think a lot of states have something similar to this, is there's multiple levels of self-defense. And, you don't lose your right to self-defense. The example that I like to give folks is, what if they have a no-gun sign and that sign is legally effective in your state? You are effectively a trespasser. Let's say you go to a movie theater, they have a no gun sign, you don't see it, or you disregard, you walk past it. If somebody comes in and tries to shoot up the movie theater, do you have to die because they posted a sign? The answer is obviously no. You get to defend yourself. But as Emily was discussing, and this is really important, is these extra layers of self-defense. Had you not been trespassing, maybe the law would presume your actions reasonable and immediately necessary, as opposed to you having to persuade a jury.
Right.
And so that's the same argument applied to, I think, our homemade firearms in this situation.
Exactly. As long as you aren't committing a crime, let us worry about the rest, I think, is just the flat answer.
So Giovanni asks, how do we improve public views on home-built firearms?
Oh, gosh, that's a great question. I think the answer is just do it.
Yeah.
More people engage in the practice. It is, and of course, I don't know how much credibility, having been born in 1986, I don't know how much credibility I get for saying this, but as a country, we have moved away from the normalization of firearms as a tool. Right? We talked to our parents and certainly our grandparents about, how normal it was to have a gun rack.
Yeah, that's the exact.
Driving to school. Yeah, in the school parking lot. So it is, I think that's a wonderful question. I love that it's being asked. Engage in the process. That's the way to change hearts and minds.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to it. Is normalization. Engage in the hobby, support your local gun stores. They still sell these kits, and maybe your gun store doesn't have to, perform a background check, but, supporting gun businesses, 2A organizations, all that. Teach your kids about the Second Amendment.
Yes.
Because a lot of people, they don't hear about this stuff until it's the news and it's put in a bad and negative light.
Right.
Let's see. We had a question from Invisible Hands. Let's say you have a serialized firearm and you want to. This kind of goes back to our modification discussion. You have your serialized firearm with a conversion kit, and you add, homemade. Let's say homemade, not insignificant parts or non-firearm parts. Does that change your calculus on anything?
And there may be states in which that changes the game, because there are states where. They are insane, right? Where they keep really good track of what the gun is based on serial number and who possesses it. But in a state like Texas, no, that doesn't change anything. In most of the country, you want to modify that weapon that you own. You should not have an issue just because you've modified that weapon that's already serialized. But again, I really, being licensed in Texas, I can't speak to what, Maryland does.
Yeah.
Right. Or Massachusetts, when you have made some sort of modification to a weapon that the state knows that you own.
Right.
I think that we're blessed to not have to worry about the intricacies of those things being down here in a much freer state.
So Martha asks, how can ghost guns be kept out of the hands of criminals since only law-abiding citizens follow the law? And I think that's a great question. It kind of ties in what we're talking about.
Thank you, Martha.
About, what we see most firearms used in crimes, they polled people in federal prison who were convicted of a crime. The second criteria is they had a firearm in their possession. And where did people, get these guns? It's from stealing them.
Yes.
It's not because the criminals spent 6 hours, diligently working on a firearm, it's because they busted out a window and stole it.
Right.
And so really the best thing that you can do to help keep guns out of the hands of criminals is secure your firearms.
Yep.
You know, we have so many guns stolen out of vehicles. You got an NRA sticker on the back of your car. You have a you know, cheeky gun saying on the back of your car. That kind of stuff makes you a target. They follow you home, you know, gun jugging. They follow you home from the gun range you stop to get a bite to eat. You know, those are where the sources of these guns come from. Criminals, Martha, it's a really, really good question.
It's a great question. And there really is. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, that's like, how do you keep bad guys from shooting up gun-free zones?
Right. Well,
you know, I mean, it's a great question, because the answer is there is a certain amount of evil that's just going to be done in the world that is uncontrollable.
Yep.
And, you know, I think that's one of the fundamental differences between where we sit on the pro-gun, anti-gun scale and where the anti-gunners go, is that we recognize that people have individual liberty. They have choices that they can make. You can't stomp on the Constitution and the Second Amendment to keep bad people from doing bad things. We take the personal responsibility for that by securing our weapons, by taking responsibility for our own safety.
Yep. Yeah, and she points it out right in the question. Only the people who follow the law are law-abiding citizens. Criminals aren't going to follow the law.
No.
And so you can criminalize murder 100 times. Is it going to stop that evil actor from committing a murder? Do they care how many times it's been criminalized? No. So at the end of the day, the gun control, it really burdens law-abiding citizens.
It does.
It doesn't burden criminals.
No.
But I think that brings us to the end of our discussion. But we hope you enjoyed this discussion about the truth about ghost guns. Tons of great questions. Keep them coming in the comments section, because this is where we source future discussions. We're going to be talking to y'all regularly. And so post your questions in the comments section. Make sure to like this video. You know, your like, your comment, it all fuels the algorithm. And we want to get this great 2A content out there. I really appreciate y'all hanging out with us. Again, I'm attorney Richard Hayes.
I'm Emily Taylor. Thank you so much. Until